I'm going to be speaking to you about some work that we've been doing using one cohort, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging. Just to give you a quick overview of my talk, I'm going to start off by defining what I understand by isolation and loneliness, give you a bit of an overview of the English Longitudinal Study of Aging. I then go on to talk a little bit about profiles of isolation and loneliness in this cohort, and then move on to some health and well-being, associations of isolation and loneliness with some health and well-being outcomes. To start off with social isolation, as has been mentioned by Emily and by Vanessa, it's a much more objective assessment of people's social networks. It's measured in several ways, ranging from some very simple assessments of whether you live with someone versus not, whether you're married versus not, to some very complex assessments that might include weighted measures of how many contacts you have, how often you see them, whether you participate in various groups, and so on. And it can be seen as a sort of structural measure because it talks about the structure of people's networks. Loneliness, on the other hand, as again has been discussed, is about dissatisfaction with your existing relationships. And it involves, to some extent, an evaluation of the kinds of relationships you have and the kind of relationships you want. And in contrast to the structural measure, that is isolation, loneliness is more of a functional measure. And as you grow older, again, given that a lot of changes to people's social networks are quite likely because of retirement, bereavement, and so on, things like isolation and loneliness become quite important. I'm now just going to tell you about the cohort that I've used in all the analyses. This is the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, or ELSA. It's a nationally representative panel study of individuals aged 50 years and over. ELSA started in 2002 with over 11,000 participants. Participants are contacted every 2 years. They go through an interview where they're asked lots of questions about their household, their finances, and their health. We also give participants a questionnaire, which includes assessment of social networks, loneliness, well-being, time use, and so on. So we have data for about 10 years now. So all the work that I'm presenting is longitudinal. Every other wave, so that's every 4 years, we also have a nurse visit with sort of fairly detailed physical functioning measures, blood sampling to assess biomarkers that are important as people age or represent health risk factors. We collect all those data every 4 years. As I mentioned before, we have 10 years worth of data, and the 12th wave 7 is currently in the field. We hope to have that data sometime around next year. We're very, very keen that the ELSA data are used for research, policy, and so on. So if you'd like more information on the study itself and are keen on using it, just come up and speak to me. I'd be happy to provide you with any information. I'm just going to talk to you now about the two main measures, the isolation measure that we used and the loneliness measure we used. The isolation measure was used as an index, which incorporated marital status, frequency of contact with family, friends, and children, and participation in social activities. Now, ELSA wasn't set up solely to look at social relationships, or it's just one of these things that we had to pool in different questions to make a sensible measure. So the scores range from 0 to 5 on this index, with 0 indicating people who are least isolated or highly integrated, and 5 being people who are very, very isolated. We have lots of measures of loneliness in ELSA. One is the single item measure, which explicitly asks people how often they feel lonely. And the second is this UCLA loneliness scale, which has been talked about recently. It's a 3-item measure. So it's quite short in what is a fairly long and sort of self-completion questionnaire that we have. So it's quite short. Again, like the other scale, it doesn't explicitly mention loneliness. You just add up responses on this, and you get a scale ranging from 3 to 9. Higher scores means more loneliness. And most of the work I present looks at this scale, except for the initial where I sort of talk about profiles of loneliness. Pretty much all the other results use this scale. I'd have, however, in some cases, classified people as being low loneliness and high loneliness, depending on scores on this scale. So just looking at profiles of isolation and loneliness in the latest wave of ELSA, I'm sorry this doesn't have a legend, I messed up. So the darkest patch represents the least isolated people, and as it gets lighter, it sort of shows increasing levels of isolation. So as you can see, the lightest patch, I don't know how clear this is about 6.3. So just over 6% of people are highly isolated. We looked at relationships with some sort of key variables. So levels of isolation do tend to increase with age. Isolation tends to decrease as socioeconomic status increases, which is you sort of see wealth or education. And we found no significant gender differences in levels of isolation. Now, this is looking at this kind of composite index. If you break down the index into different parts, so for instance, if you're interested in frequency of contact and so on, you might see gender differences. So the International Longevity Center last year had a report which looked at isolation in older men, and they found frequency of contact with family and friends and children was much lower in men. But when you add up, when you have a sort of composite index incorporating different bits, you actually don't see differences, gender differences. Loneliness, same problem, no legend, but same concept. The darkest are people, sorry, this is really bad. So again, the lightest group are the people who report being lonely often, so around 8%. Loneliness, again, increases with age. Here you do see a gender difference, no matter which scale you use. Women do report being more lonely than men, and loneliness tends to decrease as socioeconomic status increases. And now, sort of just going back to the 6.3 in isolation and the sort of 7.7, you might just say that, okay, it's pretty much the same people. So just talking about the overlap in the measures, of the people who were the most isolated, so people who had the score of 5 in the index, the highly isolated people, about a third reported feeling lonely hardly ever or never. So we're not talking about any kind of perfect correlation. So it is possible to be highly isolated and yet report feeling lonely very rarely. Right? So, which sort of brings me to why most of our work has looked at both isolation and loneliness together in trying to understand their effects on health and well-being. I'm looking at 2 outcomes here. One is cognitive function and the other is physical function, which are quite important as people age. The first set of results deals with the effects of isolation and loneliness on cognitive function. As you know, with sort of increases in things like dementia or increasing rates, which are much higher as people age, the issues of cognitive function become much more important. We looked at 2 dimensions of cognitive function, one which is recall, so participants were presented with a list of words, a list of 10 words, and were asked to which was then taken away, and they were asked to recall this immediately, and then again after a short delay. We also had a measure of verbal fluency, where participants were asked to come out with as many animals they could within a span of 1 minute. This tests a lot of different abilities in terms of being able to retrieve a particular class. Then, of course, there are sort of issues around language. You have to make sure you don't keep repeating the same animal. You have to remember that some things are not animals, and so on. We found that over this 4-year period, both isolation and loneliness were associated with decreases in recall. Isolation, but not loneliness, was associated with decreases in verbal fluency. So you do find a certain difference in the pattern of effects. What we also found that recall was significantly worse for people who were isolated and lonely. So among the highly isolated people who were also lonely, they tend to have the worst outcomes. And I think that might just be a bit clearer here. So the 3 lines are the 3 different levels of social isolation. The purple is the lowest isolation. I do have a legend this time. And the green is the high isolation group. And as you can see, generally, as loneliness increases, immediate recalls tends to decrease for all groups. But the outcome is much worse for people who are both highly isolated and highly lonely. Okay. Moving on to physical functioning, again, quite important as people age because it deals with things like balance, sort of fear of falling, and so on. We looked at 2 measures of physical function. One was an objective measure where people were asked to walk over a distance of 8 feet. It was quite a controlled kind of exercise, so it was done only on a flat surface. If people didn't feel that it was safe to walk, they weren't asked to walk. If people needed help, like actually another person helping them to walk, they were asked not to do it. Of course, if you normally use a stick or a Zimmer frame, that was fine. So it was quite a controlled test. So we also asked about difficulties that people had with 6 activities of daily living. So walking across a room, dressing, eating, bathing or showering, getting in or out of bed, using the toilet. And we assessed these changes over a 6-year period. And the analyses were only conducted in participants aged 60 years and over because only they were asked to do this walking test. Okay. And here I've just classified isolation into low, medium, and high. So low, medium, and high refers to isolation. And as you can see, there's a clear gradation. As levels of isolation increase, gait speed, or this walking speed over this 8-foot distance, tends to decrease. And you found that as over time as well, over the 6-year period, people who were highly isolated tended to have slower walking speeds. We did not find any association with loneliness for this group, however. Where we did find an association was with this activities of daily living, where people who were more lonely did report more difficulties with these activities of daily living, and reported sort of an increase in difficulties over this 6-year period. So again, like the cognitive function, you see a different pattern of effects for both isolation and loneliness. What we think is happening here is isolation might be related more to sort of initial problems with health, while loneliness might be associated with more of sort of depression, issues around suffering and disability, which may affect the way people respond to these subjective questions. Okay, I'm moving on to some more recent work that we've been doing on well-being. This work was conducted in conjunction with the International Longevity Centre UK, and much of it was it builds on this increasing move towards putting well-being at the centre of policy making. So we looked at isolation and loneliness in relation to 2 measures of well-being over a 6-year period. One is life satisfaction, which essentially asks people to evaluate how satisfied they feel with their life. So if you kind of look back, essentially. And enjoyment of life, which is more an assessment of how people feel right now, how happy you might be right now. I'm just going to sort of describe patterns of well-being, just well-being, not in relation to isolation and loneliness, over this 6-year period. And what you see with enjoyment of life is that there is an initial dip, which then sort of increases, but very, very slightly. Life satisfaction, on the other hand, has an initial dip, but does tend to rise. This enjoyment of life, like other quality measures, tends not to rise as much in older age. Life satisfaction in other work using ELSA has been shown to rise with increasing age. Looking at how isolation affects well-being. So here I've split isolation into 3 groups, so low, medium, and high. So this is the low isolation group, and as you can see, it sort of looks pretty much like the initial diagram. So, an initial drop with a slight increase. This is the intermediate isolation group. Again, it sort of almost runs parallel to the low isolation group, though consistently lower than. And the last is the high isolation group. And as you can see, they show a very sustained decrease in enjoyment of life over time. So they tend to do much poorer over time. This is what you see for the high isolation group and life satisfaction. They dip in the beginning but do go up, but the rise is quite shallow. So they don't rise as much as they otherwise would. So, and while that might seem kind of counterintuitive, why high isolation people actually do show this rise, it's because when you're thinking about life satisfaction and all the different things, you might actually give different weights to things, and maybe there are other things that matter more or people may adapt quite well to this sort of lack of social relationships, which might be why life satisfaction doesn't show as strong as an effect as you might see with sort of immediate happiness. How does loneliness affect well-being? Again, this is the low loneliness group for both. It looks pretty similar to the average, initial drop and then a rise. With a high isolation, with a sort of high loneliness group, you find, again, it runs parallel. There's no sort of significant sustained decrease. It does go up a bit, but it's always lower. And this is what you see with life satisfaction. So loneliness seems to have more of an effect on life satisfaction than it, with, again, the rise being quite shallow in this group. The next bit of work that we did was looking at sort of almost breaking down this social isolation index and trying to look at different dimensions of social networks. So we looked at 3 different dimensions. One was we just asked people whether they had any family, friends, or children, so just sort of sheer numbers. Then we asked them to talk about how many close relationships they had with their family, friends, and children. And lastly, how frequently they contacted their family, friends, and children. For each of these 3 measures, we classified them into low, medium, and high. So here, in this case, high is good. So, the higher you have more contact with family and friends, more close relationships, and more relationships present. Now, in all our analysis, the second thing, which is simply having family, friends, and children, had no effect on quality of life or on life satisfaction. So I'm essentially presenting results for the other 2, and they're pretty similar. You can see a really clear graded association that as you have more contacts and more frequent contacts and more close relationships, you tend to have a better quality of life over this 4-year period, and that's after taking into consideration a range of other factors. And similarly, as frequency of contacts and number of close relationships increase, you tend to have an improvement in life satisfaction over a 4-year period as well. Just summarizing my findings, both isolation and loneliness are important to health and to well-being, but as I've mentioned, and as you've seen now, the pattern of relationships for both is different. So it's quite important, and this is what we're trying to do, to try and understand how these patterns might vary and why this might actually be. So it's important to think of the two constructs separately and to identify why they affect health and well-being in different ways. With next steps, there's a range of things that we could talk about, and I think a range of things that has already been mentioned. I just want to focus on two things that I think are really quite important. One is, again, has been mentioned before, is trying to understand mechanisms of action. This goes back also to sort of breaking down how isolation and loneliness affect health and well-being, but also why they might be different. We've done some sort of very preliminary, pretty basic work looking at sort of health, behavioral, and biological effects of isolation and loneliness, and we do see that there are certain different patterns, but I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. The second thing is this idea of strong and weak ties, or thick and thin ties. This idea that, now if you remember the social isolation index, and I think a lot of stuff that has been talked about right now, the focus is very much on close relationships, on friends, on family, children, and so on. But there are a number of people in your network who may just be acquaintances, people you just run into on occasion. In some of the literature that's coming out here, they've even talked about simple things like talking to the barista who gives you your coffee, making eye contact and smiling at them. So we're talking about really sort of simple levels of contact which may have effects on well-being, like positive effects on well-being. So this idea of trying and understanding, moving on from just this close, immediate network to the wider sort of acquaintances, and what you might be able to do to support people more widely in building these sort of thinner ties, or encouraging even these weaker ties, might be quite useful. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Aparna. Now, final set of questions for the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. You can see one hand towards the back. So much felt like someone winning an auction. Okay, lady just there.
Hello, my name is Patrick O'Brien. I'm from a new website called Giving and Getting, which is designed to help people support each other and make widen their networks. And I'm interested in why you think there is an inverse relationship between wealth and loneliness.
I'm not really sure, to be honest, and I don't know whether it is about sort of maximizing resources in other ways. But I genuinely don't know. I have no idea. There's a sort of fairly consistent... The same with isolation. I don't really see why there is this sort of clear gradation, but I'd be sort of quite interested in knowing if there are any other views. Christina? No?
Wealthy people are healthier.
So,
they're generally higher levels of education. So,
just going to ask you to repeat that, Christina, and say who you are.
Oh, right.
You're answering that question.
Oh, sorry. I'm a person's. Thank you. I'm Christina Victor from Brunel University, and what I was saying was that wealthy people are generally healthier people, both physically and psychologically. They tend to have a higher level of education, so you may speculate that they have greater health resources, but also wider material resources. And as we know, many problems in life, money and cash is actually quite a helpful way of solving them.
Any other strong views, maybe from the previous speakers? Vanessa, do you have anything you want to contribute to that?
Only in terms of access. If you can afford your private transport and driver, etc., then fancy, you might be able to.
Where do you live, Ned?
Did everyone at the back hear that? Sorry, Vanessa, I'm going to ask you to repeat it into the microphone. Thank you.
I think in many ways you sort of tend to go round that argument. It's sort of, you still end up in the sort of graded deprivation thing. You sort of still end up going down that route. It's still about, there is a deprivation thing. And, if you're talking about health, if you're talking about access, it's still the same thing. So, yeah, not really certain why it is, but...
Vanessa, can you repeat again as well? Thank you, Aparna.
Yeah, I was just saying that the level of resources you have may influence the ways in which you can access your friends and participation through being able to afford transport, private transport, rather than relying perhaps on public transport.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Vanessa. I can see someone's already taken the mic towards them, and we'll have another mic in there as well. We'll take these two questions together if they're just single questions.
Not only,
sorry, who are you?
Not only if you've got more money, you get taxes and stuff. From experience being a person over 65, most of my friends who are widows on their own actually employ people, and they actually have very good contracts. They have a gardener and a cleaner, and there are a lot of extra social activities. Nothing to, they haven't all got children or anything, but they've got all these people they employ, so they have contact during the day, and also the
And the lady just the right there.
My name is Beryl Wade, and I belong to a research group of older people actually doing the research in these circumstances. Obviously, we've had a lot of statistics, and I must admit they blow my mind. But I would say to you that it's also age relevant, this business. I interview people who have just retired, who have a different approach completely to the 70s, the 80s, and now the 90s. I've never interviewed anybody over 100 yet, but that will come, I'm sure. But I often wonder with your statistics how much this is taken into account.
We adjust in everything for age, but I agree with you. It really is quite important to not just adjust, but possibly do something more sophisticated, possibly stratify, look whether associations differ at different age groups. I agree. We haven't done any of that. And it may just be that at younger ages, it matters less. There was a meta-analysis that came out just recently, looking at isolation and loneliness in relation to mortality, sort of comparing the two. And they tend to find that both were actually more predictive of mortality in under 65s rather than over, which I was quite surprised by, because I would have thought it would have been more important later on. But, so I think there is quite a lot of value in actually looking at different age groups. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Last couple of questions. I can see a hand right in the middle there. And then we'll pass back to the lady in the crisp shirt. Everyone okay? You say who you are and where you're from.
The Institute for Volunteering Research, part of NCDA. I want to add to the idea that to talk about older people as being over 60 or 65 it's a sort of false. There's a false dichotomy because people over 75, and I like both ages, experience a whole different range of problems that will lead to loneliness. That's the first point. That's reiterating what you just said. The second is...
Pat, do you mind just moving the microphone a little bit closer to your mouth?
Yeah. Okay, and the second point is that the importance of an individual's temperament, personality, and experience of life will have a bearing on how they feel about themselves and the surrounding environment when they become older people. And I don't think that there's any sort of distinction in the research that we've heard about between those two very different groups of people.
Thank you, Pat. We'll ask Aparna to...
So I agree completely about the age. I mean, I was reiterating that point. I agree. It's definitely work. I mean, and I think the boundaries shift. So sort of speaking about all older people as this sort of homogenous group, or setting the boundary of 50 or 60 or 70 is kind of increasingly becoming more complicated, where you draw the line. So yes, age stratified analysis, trying to understand what works for different groups, not only now, but how these groups will change over time is really quite important. The second bit personality, yes. I didn't present it here, but there was some work that I did sort of early last year, which was comparing people who were trying to look at loneliness among highly isolated people, the sort of group you'd expect to be constantly lonely all the time. But as I just mentioned, there are quite a lot of people in that group who report never feeling lonely. But I was trying to sort of look at what factors might protect or what factors might predispose people in these highly isolated groups to feel lonely or not. And personality came out as a huge factor. So sort of people who were higher in neuroticism, to some extent sort of more likely to sort of view the world as being more threatening, tend to be the people who did experience it, despite being highly isolated, did experience also experienced high levels of loneliness. But on the other hand, people with more, say, emotionally stable personalities did not experience it to the same extent. So,
we've only got a few more minutes, and I've got two hands I want to get to. There's a lady in the white shirt with your hand, yes, there, and there's a lady in front of you. So if you keep your questions relatively brief.
Thanks very much. My name is Liz Clegg. I work for Lambeth Clinical Commissioning Group in Lambeth Council. And you particularly said that given the length and the size of your study, you particularly looked at isolation and loneliness of people living in different care settings.
So initially it started off with people who were all at home. So we followed up some people to institutions, but the number is fairly small. And we're really not in a position to look at least as of now, to do anything very sophisticated for looking at changes in sort of housing setting. I hope over time we will be able to do more, but because we start, and it is still primarily for people who are sort of living at home. It's because it started off from the Health Survey for England, which is a sort of household-based survey. The majority of our people started off, the majority of our samples started off living at home. So even though we followed some of our participants as they moved into institutions, that's still a fairly small number.
And finally, the lady in front there.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Richard Sandaley, and I'm from the Lewisham Pensioners Forum. And this is a topic of interest to me, loneliness and social inclusion. I think we have to understand that some people choose to be isolated, but are not necessarily lonely. For others, it's cultural. I've got examples of both. Some years ago, a group in which I'm involved, not my own forum, we went to Manchester and met with a group of minorities up there. Well, it was a mixed group, but we were there to get minorities to engage. And we learned of one woman who lived in the basement of their restaurant for 15 years and didn't come out to meet with other people, knew nothing at all about the environment in which she lived. The other was more recently, when I heard of a woman who had just moved into an independent living home. She chose to keep to herself because she felt she was better than the other people there, and she didn't want to mix. So you see, there are different reasons for being isolated, but isolation is not necessarily loneliness, and we have to bear that in mind. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that comment. It's almost a wonderful way to wrap up, unless you've got anything to come back on. Thank you all, as Nicholas Parsons would say, you've been an absolutely wonderful audience. But especially thank you to the speakers. I think you've really kicked off the day exceptionally well. Lunch is over in the Shaw Library. We will be returning here for 1 o'clock sharp. And remember, it will take you a few minutes to run up those stairs. So thank you all for your engagement, and see you after lunch.